Hey, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us today. We're going to let a few people join and then we will get things moving here. We're very, very excited today to be joined by Denise Broder, who is a hybrid working expert. And this session is entitled Leading Hybrid Teams. A little bit quickly about Denise before we, as we let people join and get started. This will all be recorded for everybody. My name is Omar Ramirez. I am the co-founder of Collective, and we are building community resources and providing information for workplace professionals. We're very excited to keep hosting these sessions and to help you keep learning more about workplace and all the different aspects of how workplace can help teams move forward. But today we're joined by Denise Broder. She is a workplace futurist, hybrid work researcher, speaker, founder. Denise is a hybrid work researcher who develops cutting-edge thought leadership at the intersection of systems thinking, futurist thinking, and human potential. She's the founder and head of data insights for SWAYworkplace, and they are a B2B learning and development consultancy that specializes in optimizing performance and hybrid work models through measurable behavioral change. Denise, you have done a ton of immense work. Would you love to introduce yourself in like a more human fashion than just your biography, which is one, amazing, but also tell us a little bit about yourself.
Well, I don't know. I don't feel as busy as I sound. So we're going to look at that again. But Omar, thanks a million for putting this together. Interestingly, that we're SWAYworkplace. We're not kind of involved in the real estate side of things. We're very squarely kind of put ourselves in the weeds with people. And I mean like the day-to-day people that are getting it done. And we work with people on really adopting or bending hybrid to the way that we work best.
Mm-hmm.
So we partner with companies essentially to run kind of large learning programs. It could be managers, individuals, or teams, and how they come together to develop cohesion and clarity on how we work together when we are physically apart. It's kind of the problem that we look to solve.
Awesome. And I guess to jump right into it, like you're an expert with decades of experience in this. Like, do you think we've ever had a time period, and I have my own belief about this, but do you think we've ever had a time period that has been this challenging for professionals really working in our field with this much confusion and this much, confusion within the narratives even?
So, I've been on both sides of this. I've been in the corporate world for the first half of my career. So I've been on the inside company side, and now I've spent the second half of my career on the outside.
Mm-hmm.
And kind of looking over my own kind of trajectory, there's always been disruption. Like there's always been these major blips. And one, something like the 2008 financial crisis that put everyone in a tailspin. So we've had these really significant blips that made us more aware. So, the '08 financial crisis, it made us more, I think, financially aware of the world around us and the ways we put ourselves in trouble and get ourselves out. 9/11 made us more physically safety aware, and we behave differently since then. So all of these huge things that happen around us, I think, just raise our level of awareness of how we operate in the world around us. But this particular moment, though, Omar, is, I think, wildly, wildly above and different and more deeper and more meaningful. So we could never have predicted such a shift ever that we're experiencing right now. And, it's early days. We're iterating and we're fighting and we're making up and we're moving forward the best that we can. But we could never, I don't think, as a group of professionals, had predicted such a disruption in the way that we're approaching work.
Mm-hmm. And I guess let's talk about a little bit about that, about the reality of what's really happening out there, right? There's this disruption. And I think everyone's at different stages of figuring out what their next steps are, which is one of the reasons we want to talk to you about, leading hybrid teams and the reality of it. But what are you seeing out in the field right now? What are you seeing with the companies you're working with and the teams you're talking to? Whether you win that work or not, sometimes we all don't get the work, even though we have those long conversations. Like, what are you seeing out in the field with these teams that are trying to enable hybrid or teams that are interested in starting to enable hybrid? Where are you seeing them at in reality versus the narrative that we sometimes see in like the media or in online chatter?
Yeah, and the media and online chatter can be quite a doozy to try to keep up with all that's happening there. And I actually don't usually listen to much anymore because I find it very distracting because it can be it can cause you to be emotional and go in different directions. But I think that the easiest way to kind of like put an umbrella term over this is it's our experience that a lot of companies, including the people that work there, are very focused on what we call the hybrid what. And that's kind of where we are right now. Like, well, what do we want to do in hybrid? Well, I want to be remote first, but my manager wants me to be something else. The company is moving us somewhere else. So we're very much in the domain of the hybrid what. That's defining the rules of how we're actually going to come back together and make this work. But people are starting to move on to the next step, which is what we call the hybrid how. And that is just a different world. That the hybrid how is, okay, we've got this great plan. We all agreed to it, but what do we do now?
Mm-hmm.
How actually work differently when we're not working together but physically apart. So the hybrid how is like this real juicy next step phase. And that's where we live at Sway. And we're like, come on over, everyone. Let's jump in
Mm-hmm.
here and figure out what we actually have to do differently to show up differently. That's not simply the policy we agreed on the hybrid what. So I find it helpful to look at it in terms of two steps. Step one is the hybrid what. Step two is this leap into the hybrid how. Step three is, well, we'll figure that out when we get there.
Mm-hmm. So when you start talking to teams about this actually leads perfectly into what we're going to talk about next, which is like, what really is proper hybrid working? And, I guess, could we also define what hybrid is? Because I know there's some parties, which, we'll talk about this a little bit more probably later, but like some people
Yeah.
don't even think that hybrid is really a word or hybrid is really a thing. I think, definitions are, frankly, defined by the common use of them, right? Like the common use of the word hybrid has become such that it is now the term we use to describe this working style of, being partially in one location, partially located in another location. But what do you think is, one, hybrid working? And then two, what do you think is proper hybrid working?
Yeah, and it's just the best place to start is what the hell does that word even mean? Because it can be such a flashpoint. And to
Mm-hmm.
me, hybrid for us is super clear. It is simply a moment in time.
Hmm.
That's it. It's like a moment in time, and we're in this moment in time. To me, it's like when I hear hybrid, it's like a conversation piece. Like, hey, there's something happening over here that we need to start thinking about. But what's really actually happening, Omar, is that hybrid might be that conversation starter or the bucket to gather opinions in. But what we're doing is we're developing flexible work practices.
Hmm.
And to me, that's actually what's really emerging here is the idea that we're all getting really comfortable for what it means to work flexibly. And we have a really clear definition on that. Like flexible work is empowering people to choose where and when they work, but in this culture of reimagined authentic trust.
Hmm.
And that's something we can all get on board with. A hybrid is just almost like the signpost. It's saying, hey, this way, over here, but what's over there is a flexible world of work. And we think that's kind of
Hmm.
where we're going to. And, to make that mean anything to anyone, there's only 4 terms you need to know. You need to understand what co-located means, what
Mm-hmm.
remote means, what synchronous means, and asynchronous. If you take those 4 and you swallow them in and make that a new lens, then you're on your way to that destination, which is a flexible world of work.
Hmm. Interesting. So it almost sounds like in your definition, flexible and hybrid really like go together and they're really partner terms as opposed to being, I think some people treat them as somehow diametrically opposed, right? Like, or do you think hybrid is a spectrum of flexibility?
I think hybrid is a placeholder.
Interesting.
Yeah, a hybrid is simply a placeholder term, word, phrase. It's a bus stop. We've gotten off at this stop because now we're going to kind of recollect ourselves, gather, and figure out where we're going next, which is flexibility. But that's also why,
Mm-hmm.
Omar, I think that early days, like the idea of looking at the word remote, also threw people up in the air because, well, what does that mean? And to me, remote is a technique that is
Hmm.
part of flexible working, of which hybrid is a direction. At some
Hmm.
point we're not going to use the word hybrid anymore. I'm hoping we're getting closer and closer to hybrid being out of our vocabulary completely, and then it's just going to be the way we work.
Interesting. Yeah. So at
Yeah.
some point it will just transition to being just the way that we actually work.
Yeah, well, how do you see hybrid? Like, what do you think about when you hear hybrid?
I think I would agree with you. I'm a pretty amenable person, but I think I would agree with you that it feels transitional in some ways. It feels as though we're all trying to move towards that future of how we're going to be working in the future and defining that new way of working. I think it's going to take us a number of years. I don't think it's going to be a short bus stop. I think
Mm.
if anything, there might be more stops along the way. But I think as much as progress was, or the way of working was progressing across the world, even before the pandemic, right? We had some companies that were doing ABW. We had some companies that were fully remote. We had a good mixture of different types of working models already before the pandemic. I think now that growth has just been exacerbated And I think that
Mhm.
what we're seeing with the teams we talk to as collective, but also in our other lives, my co-founder and Kayla and I, we see a large mixture of different types of models in countries and regions that we never would have thought to see those models start to take hold. For example, like more flexible work policies in different regions. I remember talking to a head of country in APAC midway through the pandemic, and he was like, "Yeah, we don't need a desk for every person anymore because we can sometimes work from home." Which in like that country in APAC, that specifically that he was in, before the pandemic would have been like, wow, like people working from
Right.
home would have not been a thing any day of the week. You're either
Mhm.
out sick or you're in the office. And I think that we're going to see that the different levels of progress kind of keep going, I think. And I think that, how long people are at the bus stop or at this stopping point of hybrid and like before they move to flexible working will be an interesting thing to see for different companies in different regions as well, and even different cities in the US.
Yeah, and for companies that are global by nature, their
Hmm.
evolution here is even trickier because the geographic regions are taking off at different pace at different speeds. So in the US here, we're still kind of very much at loggerheads, and we're fighting the sandbox over the decision of where and when to work. And again, that's the natural first stage. You have to figure that bit out. But I think in Europe, they're a lot more settled in. In the Asian market, they're a lot more, I think it's 70% back to office. And in the Southern American market, they've already made a decision like collectively, and now they're wondering what's next. But I feel, are still kind of very early on in that process of really deciding, almost like democratically, what are we going to do? Like, what is our model going to be, and how are we going to make this work?
And I do think that's something that every company and every industry and every vertical kind of needs to decide for themselves, right? And I think there will be this natural decision-making process for each industry. And we're kind of already starting to see that. We see banking trying to pull back, much more financial, trying to pull back much more heavily. Whether that's successful or not, big question mark. I know you also worked in the financial system
Yeah.
for a long time. But I think, every different type of industry is going to have this moment where they're going to have to figure this out. Whether or not they want to figure it out and how long they resist trying to figure out their future of work is probably something that will come back to haunt people in the next 5 years. Um, but I think it's important for people to start to move towards kind of what is that like to a true model of flexible and hybrid working, or from hybrid to flexible working for themselves. So I guess that brings us to kind of like our next point, which is, Denise, what does like proper hybrid working look like, and how do people get started just building a base program? I think, a lot of us in the workplace world and in the HR world as well, they tend to be people who are sole practitioners or solo practitioners at the companies, especially
Mhm.
for the smaller, startups and things of that nature. How can those people get started with just kind of, moving along and just getting started with building a program, or trying to even, build that uh, intention internally to get things moving?
Yeah, and when you say that, you're referring to workplace professionals, people that are
Yeah.
responsible for physical space?
Well,
Um,
physical and like when we define workspace, like a workplace, I should say, for a collective, we kind of put the whole gamut of everybody in there. So it's like people, employee engagement, employee experience. We think of like work and place as a combination of those two things. So like
yeah.
people who define work and people who define place working together.
So this is a great question because I just had an experience yesterday that gave me some new insight on this. I was in the city at a briefing by a company that collects data on the effectiveness of workplaces globally, and they have a lot of insight into it. And in the room were senior workplace folks at big companies. Super interesting for me to get in there, then from my aspect, and really see what are they talking about or what are they not yet talking about. Helps me understand where are we in our progression.
Hmm.
And what I found wild, Omar, is the discussion was framed in terms of forward thinking. Let's stop. Step one is let's define the purpose of the office. Step
Hmm.
two is to decide the function that that purpose serves. And step three is to find the form. What a physical form should that take? Which is like, looking into your workplace bucket and pulling all the amenities that you would like to have or not have.
Hmm.
And that is a very forward thinking way to look at it, but I felt that the conversation was missing, I think, the most important thing. Like, before you can even define what is the purpose of the physical office, there's a step before that. You have to really, really reflect on why are people so resistant to come to a physical office. And we're never not going to
Hmm.
be resistant to that unless we change the way that we're programming it. So I think that we have to get really deep and understand what's changed in people. Not necessarily what's changing about the office, but what's changed in people that we
Hmm.
understand understood about ourselves in the last couple of years, because if you're not starting from the proper why did this change happen? And why do I care? Why do they care? And why are we even having this conversation about physical space? Then I think you're missing a really important piece, because space, the physical space is no longer the office, is no longer the dominant piece of the puzzle. It's now up on the side, and the human person is at the center, which is a big shift. Because workplace people think like workplace people because the industry's been so defined for so long, but you have to shake it up and go back to the precursor step of why is this change even happening?
Yeah, and I think that is kind of, you put it really well, which is like putting the person back at the center of this circle of services. We kind of define employee experience or workplace experience as everything from hire to retire, right? So the first conversation you have with somebody who's recruiting you, like that's a part of your experience at that company, right? And like the last conversation you have with somebody, physical place is just one single part of that, right? Like whether you're being accommodated when you're working from home, whether you're being accommodated when you're working from a third space, or whether you're being accommodated while you're working from a physical dedicated office, all of those things are different experiences. But yeah, you're right. You need to pull it back. I think that really, like that advice of pulling it back to understanding the base level. What are we trying to accomplish? Like, what is our why for moving this thing forward before you start to define the how, when, and where. And like starting with that sense of purpose is really important.
Totally. And you start that practically by examining the assumptions that you make subconsciously about decisions you make in your line of work. Like we all make assumptions about our world. That's how we get through it. And we all have assumptions about how our specific industries work. But that's where you got to start, is re-examine the assumptions that you're making, because everyone else's assumptions have changed. So you have to also revisit your assumptions that you base all of your decision making on. And that's just it's a reflective process, and it's a conversation among senior leaders.
Interesting. So actually, question on that. This is a side question on that. How long should people be giving themselves to start figuring this out, right? Like I think companies tend to think of things as projects versus programs. And I think they think of solving this problem as a project. And a lot of the companies we've spoken with and a lot of the teams we've spoken with, they're like, oh, well, we're going to solve our future work problem in 6 months. And we're like, well, that's an interesting concept. I'm excited to talk to you in 6 months. I want to see how this goes. I hope you do. And then we can all learn from you. But what do you think is like an appropriate amount of time for somebody to dedicate to this? Or do you think it's a project versus a program?
I think it's neither. And the reason I say that is because when you think of a project, it's a beginning, a middle, and an end, and an evaluation. Did it work? Did it not? Scrap it, go, next. This is not necessarily considered a project, because it is such a human endeavor of mindset, fears, hopes, desires, why we want to work, why it's matter to me. It's a very much more deep undercurrent thing. So again, it's the whole idea of just take everything we know, turn it upside down, let's look at it from a different perspective. So I don't think it's ever, there's never going to be an end to this conversation, because the future of work is a journey. It's not a destination. It's always been a journey. We've been evolving. We are constantly evolving. We cannot condense evolution into a box and say, here's the beginning and the end of a project. So maybe step number one is considering that it's not. But that is terrifying for people that are graded, ranked, and compensated and paid for hitting objective numbers and quantifiable numbers. It's terrifying. It's easy for me to say that, but terrifying for somebody who is going to be graded next month if they didn't hit this thing. And that's why that fear factor is what's preventing people from having these honest, open conversations that are underpinning the strategy of the future of work, more specifically hybrid work. So let me give you an example of what I mean by out-of-the-box thinking. In this conversation we were in yesterday, one of the leaders was discussing the idea of this particular building in Southern Manhattan and noticing that they've observed in their tenant population, a very high number of people would cycle to work. So it's green, they're cycling. And then they were taking that cycling and they were using that and saying as a selling point for why to come to that district of Manhattan, because it was cyclable, right? And then how do you begin to market that lifestyle component to the way and to the offer of a workspace? And I said, because work is emerging as a lifestyle choice. So we had to think of it as a lifestyle. And the other interesting example that came up yesterday had to do with there was an idea of maybe we start looking at weather. And maybe the seasons will impact usage of an office space. And perhaps we should start using that as a part of our planning tool. And I'm thinking, well, weather is actually a commodity. You can trade weather on the financial markets. So like maybe in the future, occupiers and building owners will use financial trading of weather to create a floor on their expense and their risk. So they're more comfortable or flexible using office space. So that's kind of very out of the box thinking. That's really kind of mitigating the risk and moving it in different ways.
Yeah, that's interesting. I think there is a, what we might call a seasonality to work as well, right? I think it follows natural cadences in different regions. We all kind of joke about our colleagues taking off the month of August, in different regions. And, obviously that is not always the case in the US, but I think, there was an interesting point made recently that, Americans are getting more comfortable, or people in the United States, I should say, not Americans, but people in the United States are getting more comfortable taking vacation finally. And I think that's a very post-pandemic trend. But I think you're right. There might be a seasonality to this as well. And that's kind of interesting from a physical location perspective, especially when we see more and more teams, as part of their hybrid programs, doing these on-site offsites where they're bringing people to their physical spaces more and basically running like a concierge level program for, having these events and continually having these events. I think it's interesting to see. It'll be interesting to see how that kind of ebbs and flows for those teams. Because we have seen a number of teams starting to get a little worn out from the number of events they're suddenly having to support on site, in order to accommodate this, culture program that is working really well. I think, Atlassian, Annie Dean had posted that they had 90% of their people come through their spaces within the past year. And that's amazing that they're getting that many people through their spaces at least once in the past year. Hopefully we're getting that number correct. We'll double check it afterwards. But I think that, those kinds of programs and that seasonality might become even more intense as we have, obviously in New York today, you're having an extreme weather event. And, things like that happen that used to, be I remember once, commuting through a blizzard in New York. Well, many times I've commuted through a blizzard in New York, but I also once, finished up a move just before a hurricane hit in New York City. Now with people, being able to work from home and having their setups more defined, it's much easier to default to working from home whenever there's a crisis or whenever there's chaos, right? So like anytime there's an event that can trigger working from home, you have this default to go back to. And it's almost as though home is the default as opposed to the office is the default.
So I was telling you right before we came on that I just met somebody in our space, in our community for coffee this morning that happens to live locally. And when the weather was so bad outside this morning in New Jersey where we live, she sent me a message. She goes, do you want to just meet on a video call as opposed to meeting together in person and getting out into the rain? Now, I'm from Ireland. I grew up in the west of Ireland. Rain is all I know. So I'm like, I didn't even notice it was raining. But of course we're going to meet in person. But there was an option to default to video if, the weather wasn't terrific. We didn't want to get soaked and then miserable when we were together. We did. But the seasonality, I think the weather, again, if you buy into the fact that work is a lifestyle, which we think it is, you're going to start seeing all of this differently.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I like we got a comment on LinkedIn that says working solution issues cannot be solved with a pizza party. I like that comment. It's a little salty, just like pizza, but I like it. And it's absolutely correct, right? We can't solve these deep human problems with niceties and parties and offsites and onsites and what some might call celebrations and engagement events, right? These deep-seated issues are tough. I actually had this. I had a head of DEI from a company come up to me after a panel I spoke on this week, and I think we talked about this a little bit, Denise, previously, and we will get back on track here. But he said to me, he's like, it feels like we're all kind of distracted. And I said, yeah, like it feels like we're distracted by this, debate about RTO or hybrid or remote. And we're not really focusing on the things that we should be doing for people, right? Like enabling accessibility, enabling programs, like creating great employee engagement and solving the real, like compensation issues and engagement issues, like solving these real issues that people have. We're focused instead on this debate about how much time is enough to be in a physical space. And so, hopefully we can start to move past those distractions and move back into doing our jobs, which is, creating these great experiences and also enabling people to do their best work of their lives, which I think should be the goal of any team. What do you think about that though?
I mean, of course, on paper is the goal. That's for sure. Everyone can sign up to that. But honestly, I don't even know if it's the RTO debate. I don't even think that that's really what the issue is. Returning to office is just code for who's got the power here.
Mm-hmm.
This is such a rebalance of power and decision making at scale, like we've never, ever, ever seen before. That I think that that's what it is. Personality wise, if you tell me to do something, I'm going to do the opposite because I don't like being told what to do. Well, you can ask my
Yeah.
husband. We've been through this for years. That's a kidding. I love him a lot. You just don't tell somebody what to do. We're adults, but
Yeah.
that's different. Telling me to be somewhere at a certain time, to show up on a certain day, to do a certain thing, behave a certain way. That's what's changed for us. We don't want to be
Mm-hmm.
so cloned and boxed in. We want to be a little more free and flexible and autonomous to make choice. And perhaps that's why Atlassian has such a high rate, because people can choose whether to be together or not. And most times they will,
Mm-hmm.
because we're adults that want to move our projects forward, want to do our job in the minimum amount of time so we can live the rest of our lives out. So we're all searching for the same thing. But I think it's the power balance, I think, is really what could be causing the friction.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think the power balance is interesting because I think Nick Bloom had a really good point about this, and Brian Elliott as well, where they were showing, Castle Systems, quote unquote, back to work tracker, where they're tracking badge swipe data across the United States. And, you could see through the pandemic, you saw the first dip in 2020, and then the second dip during Delta, and then the third dip during Omicron. But it was really, I think and they think they were making this point as well, which is it was the reiteration of those three different times of going backwards,
Mm.
where that really reinforced this power shift,
Yeah.
where it was like go stop, go stop, go stop, and that has shifted everyone's mindsets. Where now Leesman Index had some good research on this as well, where they're saying that the cost of going to work, or the cost of commuting to an office, quote unquote, or going to work, has moved in employees' minds from
Sure.
like a normal cost of living to a cost of working. And that mindset shift for employees is something that is very real. And now everyone is deciding what they're letting back into their lives post pandemic. People are making these decisions at different paces, but they're like, yeah, like they're more likely to opt out of things sometimes. And they're more likely to say, I'm not willing to do that for this. I'm not willing to do this anymore. Or what am I going to get in exchange? What's the equivalent exchange here for my additional time to be, spending 2.5 hours every day in my car, or whatever the crazy commute might be, or, 2 hours on the subway each way in New York City.
I think that's like the way I think about that is we're moving into, we may be in the digital age, maybe in all the, I don't know, fourth industrial revolution, but I think we're moving into the age of awareness. We are
Mm-hmm.
far more aware of what's happening. How did we ever know how painful it was to get up an hour earlier, to get completely, utterly dressed, get in a car or a train, to spend $20 on a lunch, and then do it all coming back on a train likely delayed?
Mm-hmm.
I think in the past, like pre-pandemic, we didn't really even really, as you say, we have our own personal balance. That was a balance sheet item from the finance, but now it's become a cost because we're aware of it. And now we can measure the difference between getting up, dressing casually, and working from your home office or kitchen table versus the commute into an urban center. We understand now because we felt the difference between the two. So you're going to have to give me a really good reason for why I need to go back to basics and get into an office. It has to be a good motivation for such, because now we know we are more aware of the way that we fit into the world around us and what work means to us. I think that when I mentioned earlier about that conversation from yesterday, like purpose of the office, function of the office, and the form it takes, that first precursor step has to be this kind of a conversation. We are aware now,
Mm-hmm.
and that those variables have changed for us, and that's how you make good decisions, by thinking about those things.
Yeah, and I think you're right that what Atlassian, as an example, is doing is giving their people the freedom to make those decisions themselves. And they are obviously providing some guidelines. I'm sure they have security guidelines and things of that nature. And I'm sure they have, also requirements for like where you can and cannot work from if you're going to travel internationally and things of that nature. Every HR department worth their salt is going to have those requirements, and every IT department is going to have those requirements of their employees. But they're giving people a big box to work within, and that
Yeah.
sense of freedom inevitably allows teams to do, team level agreements and things of that nature, and like self-organize in some ways. It is going to be a little bit longer process and a little bit more messy, but I think that might be a slightly longer path. But do you think that's probably more likely going to win more people than just do it this way, here's the blueprint, execute?
So the difference between, I think, the old world and the new world is that we've got options now. We didn't have
Hmm.
options before. There was one way to do, one way to show up, one thing to do. And it was great because that's all we ever did. So we didn't know any better. Now that we're
Hmm.
aware of this new world of work, options are in our favor. The option to show up physically, the option to show virtually, the option to get
Hmm.
together in office, the option to not. So if we have a suite of options, it doesn't have to be every single option in the world, which can be overloading. Let's define the ones that matter to our team, our culture, our companies, and give me options. Because if
Hmm.
I have options and my team have the options, we're likely to coalesce and build consensus around what works best for us in the moments that we have to come together or not. If you have
Yeah.
those options, I think that's a huge component of it.
And I think it can actually be a benefit to the people who work in workplace as well. I actually talked to a leader recently when we were at an event, and she said that the typical way we choose real estate and spaces would be to go and assess the place your company wants to be in that city. Understand the like financials, understand the demographics, understand who you're trying to hire, but also you would say, okay, well, here's where all of our current employees live. If you're moving offices, you'd say, here's where all of our current employees live. Let's do a radius map and understand where we want to place this physical location. What she was doing is actually using their flexible working partner to map where employees were using co-working spaces and which ones they were naturally gravitating towards,
Yeah.
and then using that as the start of the search to understand where people were naturally already commuting towards and where they were automatically picking to coalesce as a team. And as the team got to, I think it was 30 plus people, or the group got to 30 plus people, then they would decide, okay, do we need a physical space, and start that discussion, but using that co-location as the signal. And
Yeah.
I thought that was interesting because they're almost allowing people to roam and
Yeah.
seeing where they meet up,
Right.
and then saying, okay, let's make a decision based off this. So you're turning it into a strength as opposed to turning it into, or treating it as something that's a weakness.
Exactly. And that's the intelligence in new ways of working. And that's taking the same thing we had before, flipping it up and looking from the other side to look at where are people naturally moving towards and then building a strategy around that. But let me throw something else at you here. And I want to get your thinking on this. Another conversation I had yesterday with these group of leaders is one leader of a workplace leader of a very large financial firm had described to me that part of her job is evaluating their different workplaces. So they're spread
Hmm.
across the U.S., they're across the world, and it's a ranking system. And she says this is the most wild thing. She's like, we just issued surveys, a few months ago. They got the results back. There was this rinky-dink little office down in Delaware that had no artwork, ugly-looking carpet. She'd been there several times. She said the cafe was okay, but not great. She walked in and she was like, we need to do something here. And when all the
Hmm.
results came back from all of their physical spaces, that had the highest rating from the employees of how much they loved going there. And
Hmm.
she said, we dug into it more. So even though you had these really plush centers of work and all of their larger cities that were gorgeous and modern and glass and air and light, this rinky-dink little place in Delaware, the reason people loved that was because they loved being around the people that were there.
Hmm.
Aesthetics, form, function aside, the purpose that space filled for them, they loved the community of people they were around. So they went there and go there all of the time. So it just really made me wonder, are we even looking at the right things when we think about workplace and the decisions and strategies we're making? Does that tell us something about how we
Yeah.
view, you know what I mean? Like the family feeling.
Well, I think that people sometimes get obsessed with this idea that a space needs to be beautiful or needs to be like there's definitely like aspects of designing a space and aspects of building a space, and people can speak to this much better than I can. But of the spaces I've built in my life, I think that there's an aspect of a space that is given to it from the physical building of the space, and then there's cultural aspects that you just can't control. And I think that
Yeah.
you can have a beautiful space with an ugly team culture, and you could have an like a not like beautiful space but a functional space with a wonderful team culture. And a lot of it is the people you put inside of it. A house is not a home without a family. And I think that in some ways,
Mm.
the same way, the physical office building does not create culture. It can be an enabler, and it can reduce friction in people's day-to-day lives through good design, but the people are what make it special. And sometimes it's really, I think it's incredibly hard to actually understand what is that thing, or what is that secret ingredient, or what is that unknown thing that makes those things happen. There's
Yeah.
a really good example of this from the NASA Jet Propulsion Laboratory here in Los Angeles. Actually, they were doing one of the when they were first trying to just get a rocket to the moon. And if I'm misremembering this, I apologize, but they were just trying to get something to land on the moon or hit the moon. And they were, setting up all these rockets, and they were sending them and sending them and sending them. And the one that actually hit and landed, when they went back and assessed, they did their kind of retro, and they were trying to figure out what was different this one time that this rocket actually finally made it. The only thing they could identify was that somebody was eating peanuts in the room when that launch happened. And so now, to this day, at the Jet Propulsion Laboratory, they, they still have peanuts in every single launch room, and they're just kind of all over the JPL labs. And it's interesting because they have, for people who have peanut allergies, they have options as well. But they couldn't figure it out. They couldn't figure out what was the variable that was different. And I think sometimes it is like that in workplace as well, and physical and people space. Sometimes it's really hard to get to the bottom of what is, what is right. But I would say for that space in Delaware, don't touch it. Don't change it. Don't do anything differently. Let those people keep going. I think there's some people who might, like that person who walked in and said, like, hey, we need to like zhuzh this space up. But you don't know if you might throw a variable off and like you try to zhuzh the space up and suddenly like, oh, it's not the same anymore.
Yes. Right.
And you ruin the vibe. Not to use like a very nascent word, but you can't measure vibe. I don't think so, at least. But
no, well, you can measure vibe. You can't measure, because that happens when people come together. It's a feeling you get, right? But so again, it maybe it's peanuts. Maybe it's like liking the people you're around. Like, who wants to be around? I was going to say a bad word. I can't because we're live. But who wants to be around people you don't want to be around, right? You're going to be averse to going to a space. But if you like the people, I'm not saying you have to be best friends or you have to pretend anything that's not there. But if you like and enjoy being around people, you're going to naturally gravitate towards them. So I wonder if far less about amenity and space. And these things, of course, are helpful. But at the end of the day, Omar, when we spend so much of our lives with people, and sometimes we don't choose who they are, I think that could be the unknown variable, that we're becoming more aware of that, more picky. I mean, why not?
Yeah, and I think we just made our next topic a lot more difficult for ourselves as well, which is like how, I mean, we talked about this a little bit because you can't measure vibe, but like, how do teams who are doing hybrid programs even start to measure success, Denise? Like, how do they start to measure, kind of the same way your person you were speaking with yesterday was trying to measure or rate their, physical workplaces? How do you actually start to get moving in that direction and actually start to understand or to quantify a little bit of, are we doing a good job here, or are we doing this program well?
So this is a huge one to answer and a huge one to think about. And the idea of productivity, I mean, please, God, I can't take that word anymore. It means nothing. And it's like a weapon. It's become a sword in a conversation. But it doesn't mean anything. It's like the word nice. Nice doesn't really mean anything either. We are always going to need measurements. Like, did my team hit the goal? Did they miss it? By how much? And what are the implications of that? But I really think, though, Omar, is that this idea of leading towards outcomes is important as a North Star, but it's not enough. So I wonder, should we focus less on the quantifiable measurement of success by actual hard, cold numbers? And do we go a little further up the pipe? And do we maybe focus a little bit more on how we, at a distance, influence people when we're working together but physically apart? Because like we're leading hybrid teams, one of the strategies we work with leaders is you need to be able to influence your people in a social way before they miss a goal, before they hit it, before they exceed it. And that's everything about understanding the qualitative nature of a person. So I know you code. I know you're great at this coding program. I get all the physical stuff, but what else do I need to know about you? So we help people back up and help leaders to really, through a tool we created, understand the nature of their team from almost like from a personality perspective. And one of the things we ask for is like, or do you know your team's communication style? Do you know their feedback style? Do you know when based on their chronotype, do you know when they're firing on focus work and firing on collaborative work? Do you know how they exhibit themselves when they're really under stress? If we know these collection of things about a team as a leader, I know how to influence my team to make decisions when we are working together but physically apart. So I'm not going to be surprised when I get to the end and I'm measuring for success on a hybrid program by measuring whole cold hard facts about goals and numbers and KPIs. We have to get more human in the way we think about leading people, and that's what I think that has to change.
Yeah, I think you're pointing to something really interesting here because you're kind of almost saying it's a qualitative and
Yeah.
quantitative, and then kind of finding that in between mixture of those two things.
Yeah.
And yeah, like understanding people's communication styles, understanding
Yeah.
how they react, where they're doing their best work, when they're doing their best work. I think that's something that and you can correct me if there's a different or better resource for this, but I think team level agreements are one of those things that people try to use. Do you think that's a good tool for people to use to like help identify some of these nuances?
Yeah, so this is a wild story. So at the end of last year, we worked with super large tech company who came to us. I was like, wow, that's wild. Why are they coming to us? I know for sure they're ahead of the curve on their team agreements and their way of thinking. But when we got
Hmm.
into it, they did have great team agreements. And it's part of our process. It's super important. But that's very much like I mentioned on the hybrid what. Here's an
Hmm.
agreement that we're all going to agree to. But they couldn't implement it. They couldn't get that agreement off the paper and into real life. And that's what I
Hmm.
mean. The hybrid how is so different. So we actually use that strategy I just talked to you about knowing the nature of your team for
Hmm.
them to really understand how do we actually influence decision making on our team when we're at a distance, so we can abide and live by the principles of that team agreement, because those are two different things.
Hmm. Yeah, and I think that's an interesting point because they are very much different things. So I
Yeah.
guess when you're talking with these teams, and I know there's a little bit about this, and we're going to leave a little bit of time for Q&A as well, but can you talk a little bit about the difference in the way you approach things with Sway Workplace? Because I think that it's interesting to me. You highlighted a difference between process and methodology, and
Yeah.
what does that really mean to you? And like, how do you approach it differently in that aspect when you're looking at these kinds of like setups and like doing these interactions with folks?
Yeah. So, and that's why our work is really interesting. We picked a very specific way of doing this. And I
Hmm.
think we're starting to get traction with it because people are beginning to understand that, like, if there was a magic formula, so if E equals MC squared, formulas we can all abide by and believe in, then we think that the success in hybrid is 50% mindset shift, 50% skills and techniques, and in that
Hmm.
order. So all of our work actually starts with mindset work. So
Hmm.
all of our facilitators are previously corporate workers that speak the language, but they've become career coaches. So we actually train through the language of coaching. And the first thing we do is really address mindset and reduce limiting beliefs, reduce fear, increase optimism and hope, see people feel seen, heard, and valued, and give them techniques for how to see each other when they don't. And just that mindset shift, it's just a little shimmy to the left, it's a little shimmy to the right. It's not like you're going to wake up. I'm going to tell you the sky's green. It's never been blue. It's not like mind altering stuff, but it is a mindset shift that has to happen first about how we see ourselves interacting with our team and fitting into our new ways of working. Then, with that empowered state, you can drop in these new skills and techniques and
Hmm.
processes and take that from off of paper and into your day-to-day life because you're motivated to do so. So it's new muscles, it's new twitches, it's new everything, but it has to be done cohesively across a larger group of people that are working together so you can manage that at scale.
Hmm. Yeah, so I really appreciate that. I think like the idea of changing people's or shifting people's mindsets
Yeah.
first has to be so critical because it's kind of like the same way we talked about definitions in the beginning.
Yeah.
When you would walk into a room with executives and everyone would say, "Oh, hybrid working," they all might have five different versions of what hybrid working is to them or their personal definition of what hybrid working is. And then you have to kind of like build that kind of linked mindset. Is that kind of how you think about that? Is like
Exactly.
building that, that common mindset for like what we're going to be doing moving forward?
Yeah. So that's what we do. We go in and we kind of like bust the conversation wide open with mindset work, and we level the playing field just on the thought process. Because only
Hmm.
when you have a clean slate can you really begin as a team or of a person or a senior leader to really begin to reassemble how your team works together when we're working together and physically apart. And I'm repeating that because that's the most important thing. We're working together and we're physically apart. So we have to develop the skill of relational intelligence, which is a big component of our work and our and our philosophy.
Interesting. Yeah, the relational relational intelligence is
Yeah.
it. I think that the mindset shift is one of those things I think is under misunderstood by people in that, when you say those words, I think there's could be people who are like, normal employees who say like, oh, well, I don't want to be influenced by my employer. I don't want to be like, influenced into doing X or doing Y. But I think that there's an element of, enablement where we're saying, hey, we want to help you learn and understand how to do things in a better way in order to understand how to be more productive and understand how to, know yourself better. And I think that change management piece is also super important, of saying like, hey, here's what we're trying to accomplish with this change, and helping them come along the journey, as opposed to being something that's kind of like in the background. What do you think? Like, how do you handle that within companies, or do you get involved in that work, or do you bring in other partners for that?
Oh yeah, we go deep on that because that's what go back to the earlier comment about the power shift. There was a
Mm-hmm.
lot that we were told, we were governed, if you will, to do certain things in a certain way, show up
Mm-hmm.
certain, leave, come at a certain time, leave at a certain time, bring a certain part of yourself to work in this way. And we're going to measure, quantify, and pay you as such. So for so long, we were kind of told what to do. That the real shift now, Omar, is that we have to make a lot of decisions for ourselves.
Hmm.
A huge amount of decisions we never had to make before, we now have to make for ourselves. When we're not physically together, we're responsible for our whole environment that we work in. When we're not in an office, we're responsible for reimagining how we communicate with my stakeholders when we're not in an office. A lot of it has fallen on the individual person. So hell yeah, there's a huge amount of shift on that power rebalance comes responsibility. So we talk a lot about personal responsibility of the individual. Are
Mm-hmm.
you stepping up in new ways? Are you being personally responsible for everything around you? Because you are now. And that's the trade-off. If you want flexibility at scale, you have to be personally responsible. So, it's not influencing from I'm going to mind control you to doing what I want you to do. It is saying I'm no longer an office first manager. I am a coach and mentor from a
Yeah.
distance. And I'm going to influence you to reach your goals in the best ways that I know how. But a lot's on you. You have to shift too.
Mm-hmm. And I think that's kind of, a lot of this ties in together, right? With that, even the shift from measuring, widgets to, measuring outcomes, and understanding
Yeah.
that we're moving into a new type of quote unquote productivity. We're moving into a new type of working that perhaps a lot of industries will take some time to catch up with, and a lot of leaders have not been trained on. So I think there's also like a huge portion of that is education and learning and development. I think
Yeah.
we're going to take, I think, a few questions, and we'll keep chatting through this as well. But I think we had an interesting question about uh, the thoughts on the J.M. Smucker's RTO plan. Which, have you read about this as well? I'm sure you have, Denise, at this point.
Read it. I couldn't sleep one night when I read it. I almost got like a tattoo of James Smucker's on my arm. I was so impressed with it.
Just
I was
jelly.
like, yeah, it's just like a jar jelly. Absolutely loved it. And I wrote a lengthy post on this on LinkedIn. I was thrilled with it, unlike any others I've seen to date. And you know why? Because going back to the conversation we've been having, they aligned incentives
Hmm.
to the people and gave them choice. And one of the major big components was that, they made a decision on having these core weeks that are
Mm-hmm.
every other week during the year, except for I think it's July or August and December. Very reasonable. People are in holiday mode in December and oftentimes traveling for, vacations in the summertime. So first of all, it started off realistic. It was
Mm-hmm.
realistic to set core weeks in that pattern. And the idea was core weeks, you have to be there for a certain percentage of the core week. Now you can
Hmm.
live wherever you want, but you got to be there. A schedule published in advance, so it's not a surprise. It repeats, so it's a routine, and I could develop habits around. What I loved about it is there are people now that are super commuters. They live on one side of the country, and they will commute via plane on core weeks, spend those few days, and then return on their dime, though.
Mm-hmm.
So, because to me, for example, if I was in California and I was traveling to their headquarters in the middle of the country, I would do that because it matters to me and it's worth the spend. Or I could choose to live locally and drive to work. So by
Hmm.
aligning, and I called it, it's your dime, your time, but it's worth it to me.
Interesting.
That's the essence of choice. That's what I loved about it. It really personified and exemplified what we mean by flexible work. Here's a set of choice. You choose on the lifestyle you want to live. That's why I love the idea of it. I was a huge fan of it.
Interesting. Yeah, I think that there's a part of that there where it's like, do you think that this somehow benefits higher level employees, or like more senior employees, more than it does um, younger employees as well, though? Do you think that there's a problem like there with like that kind of like benefit being more for people who have more, resources and more ability to, have better resources from that standpoint?
I wouldn't look at it like that because you can't equalize stage of life. We all go through stages of life where our responsibilities may change, our resources might change. You can't equalize for that. How can I? Can't do that.
Mm-hmm.
I can give you the choice to do as you wish. And that's, I think, where the equality comes from.
Interesting. Yeah, and I think there's a part of that too, right? Where there's like a part of life where, or a season of life where you might want to work for a company that has more time in a person, and you might want to work and maybe this ties into the seasonality as well, because my wife and I often talk of life as seasons.
Yeah.
And in this season of life where I am a younger employee, I might want to be spending more time. I might be living, as I was in New York City, I might be living in a place where I want to be more in person, or I might want to be a remote employee to start my career. And I think that,
Yeah.
choosing, do you think that maybe this actually opens up more options for people to think about what kind of company do I want to be working at? Where do I perform best? Is it a hybrid company or a flexible company or a remote company or a, in-person company?
I almost think you have to look at this from a different perspective, not even from that perspective. And I don't think the first question to ask yourself is, what is the kind of company I want to work for? I think you have to first start with yourself. What is the kind of work lifestyle that I want for the season of my life? So right now I
Mm-hmm.
have two main jobs. My first job is raising my children. The second
Mm-hmm.
is developing and building Sway. They're two very, very serious jobs with long-term ramifications. And I distribute my time based on what's needed. But that's my season of life and my work lifestyle I've chosen now. So
Mm-hmm.
somebody that is right out of college might have a different lifestyle. Somebody that is more senior or maybe in the second act might have a different work lifestyle. But I think we've got to start asking ourselves first, because now we've got options. What is the
Mm-hmm.
work lifestyle I want to live for this foreseeable future? And then find the situation that attunes to that, if possible. And I know it could be different. Maybe you need to pay the mortgage. You got to do what you got to do. But we're starting to shift the way we're thinking about this.
Yeah, and I think that with that shifting, there are things you have to do, right? There are absolutely situations where you have to, do certain things in order to enable your family to have enough to eat, right? To have enough to survive, to have enough to, go on. And I think that those life situations and those life contexts, I think we're taking those more into consideration in a business standpoint now. Um, do you think that companies are doing a good job or a good enough job of taking those, situations into context? I think, when people are calling these RTO movements, et cetera, I think often they're calling them without the cognizance that, hey, like, we want people to come back for our sake, but who are you kind of affecting? What's the windfall effect of this on families, et cetera?
Yeah, and that's the difference, right? What's your personal perspective on this versus the company perspective, and the ideal scenarios that we're meeting in the middle. But I mean, like Omar, if somebody said to you right now, "I'm going to offer you a job, and it's 5 days a week in the office," like that would just feel so foreign to think about. In today's, so much has shifted that if somebody was to offer you a new job and say 5 days for an average kind of job, it would be hard to think about that when you know there's other options out there. But
Yeah.
also conversely, like a company saying we're only going to hire people that can drive to our office, you've
Hmm.
completely limited your pool of people that you can work with, which
Yeah.
in today's world where we are seems also like a really difficult. Why would you decide that? There is so much talent around. Only if I can only drive to you. That's the radius where we're drawing. So those two
Hmm.
things were so common only a few years ago. Now we're questioning, is that really the right way to think about it? So there's benefits on both sides to widening our perspective.
Interesting. I think we have another question. Do you believe the C-suite influence holds back such change for working solutions?
Yes.
Say more,
Yeah.
Denise. Say more.
um, I have a lot of empathy. I have a lot of empathy for the three main groups that we see. One are individuals. They're getting out there every day. They're getting their work done. They're feeding their families. They're being in their community. There's a
Hmm.
lot of uncertainty for these folks. I have huge empathy for middle managers that were never taught to lead hybrid teams. That's a whole
Hmm.
new skill set that you need, and they're struggling too. And the C-suite, I know it's easy to vilify them and it's easy to kind of create a voodoo doll and just run with it, but they're under a significant amount of pressure as well to meet bottom line numbers and to meet the quarterly numbers and to look at costs. And they have a complex job that the vast majority of people do not. So I have
Hmm.
empathy for the way they're thinking about it too. But it is 100% the case that it is the contraction of wideness of looking at this at the C-suite level that is holding back a lot of these new ways of working. And I think a lot of it is it's fear, and some of it is justified. But it's like, what are our competitors doing? Who's making that first move? So it is a slower systemic move, but we have to remember something. We are moving in the right direction. It may not be the pace that you want, but we are. We're moving into flexible work, and there's no change that's ever been sustainable and good that's happened overnight. We all have to play our part. We are heading the right way.
Yeah. And do you think, I guess with that, do you think that employees eventually will kind of self-sort and select the companies that they want, or the kind of typology that works best for them? And someone in the comments was saying that, they really enjoy being in person every day, but they also respect the fact that, some people want choice and want to be doing other different things. Do you think that that is going to be kind of the future, where people are self-sorting more? Or do you think that the work will draw them to a company more than their personal preferences for how they work?
There's very limited options right now, because again, this is just in the scheme of change. We're very early. Like if we all want to be PhDs, we're probably really only in third grade right now on the evolution of working models. We're not at the first step. We're moving along. There's limited options in terms of the maturity of models and how widespread they are. So there actually isn't really a lot of choice right now. And I don't even know, like today, in today's moment, if we know even how to choose the right model. So, on this evolution arc of change, there's certain introspection that has to happen ourselves first in reevaluating what's important to us in our work and our own community lives, and then being able to open your eyes wider and step up in different ways to look for those other opportunities that are going to become more voluminous, I think, as we move on. So, today, I just don't think we have a huge amount of options yet. But again, we're in that right direction, and I think we're going to find that we do down the road.
Yeah, and I think your point about the fact that we're very much still at the beginning of this journey is a really, really important one for people to understand. I think people want us to be the same way that, executives sometimes will look at their competitors and say, oh, well, they're doing it, so why don't we do it? It's like, well, don't you want to wait and see potentially what happens when they do that before you go jumping down that road? But I think also people want us to be kind of, settled, and they want to be done. I think it's a natural human element to be like, oh, I want to like rush to the end of this, to the end of the story. But I do think that you're right there, that we are in the beginning stages of change in the future of work. And Nick Bloom talks about this a lot, where he's saying like, we've kind of returned to our original growth path, which is the growth path of, we're going to continue to grow, or, distributed work will continue to grow, a certain percentage every year, as it had previously pre-pandemic. We've gone through the massive growth spike, and now it's going to continue. Flexible work will continue to grow over time. And I think he says remote work, but I think what the definition, when you look at the underlying definition, it really reads more as flexible work than remote work. Right. I think people think remote, and they often think, someone who never sees anybody else or works in some far-flung place. But for the reality of most people, that's not really what's happening with them.
Yeah, it's true. And, just to pick up on another question that kind of came in there, Omar, about somebody being a real extrovert and really like working with people, and that energetic connection that happens when we work with people. But there's also the case that there's folks, we worked with a group out of the UK last week where one of the leaders described that a division in their company, the whole team went back to the office in full, not because they wanted to really be around each other, but because their home working environment was so terrible, or it just couldn't cut it, that they wanted to be together in an office for all those obvious reasons. So the hardest thing, I think, is really kind of like cutting down the middle of how do we personalize our work experience in a way that's part of a bigger picture for a bigger team. And that can seem so contradictory. So Natika, who likes to work with people together, could have 5 people on her team that don't want to. They're introverted. They want to be in their private, closed space. So how do you find the right balance and agreement to bring my personal sense of style and work to a team setting? And there has to be some consensus, because there's always going to be a trade-off. There's always going to be a trade-off. We live in a world where if I want something, I order, it comes tomorrow. If I want media and entertainment, I can get it right now. If I want food, I can get DoorDash right here. We've got no patience anymore. We are so impatient in the world around us that we've closed ourselves off from having to make decisions with other people. And I think that's also kind of holding us back, or testing us. Testing us.
Yeah, it's testing us.
We're being tested. being tested.
And I think, Nitika, you actually had a really good point in the chat as well, where, surveying your people and understanding your people. You talked about a little bit about this earlier, Denise. Getting
Yeah.
to understand your employees deeply. The way I talk to people about this all the time is you would never build a product without understanding who your customers are. Why would you ever build an employee program without understanding who your employees are?
Yeah.
I think that, no, you wouldn't do it. And I think that hopefully that's something that everyone can kind of take away from this. But Denise, we are at the hour. I really, really, truly appreciate you taking so much time with us today and having you with us for Collective. I know we had some issues on the back end streaming to one location, but we're going to post this on our YouTube channel. It's going to stay on LinkedIn, and we'll also be posting in the community. Denise, where can people find you and SWAYworkplace the easiest?
The easiest place is actually just follow me on LinkedIn. I put a lot of our work out there, and our website is linked off my primary page. So Denise Broder on LinkedIn. I'm there all the time. You can find me there anytime.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for taking the time, Denise. Thank you, everyone, for joining, and have a great day.